When the Trump-Putin meeting will take place in a few days' time, a ceasefire could be within reach. But will the threat of secondary sanctions and increased international pressure force Putin into submission? Could this meeting change the dynamics of the war in Ukraine, and if so, when? Ian Brzezinski, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, joins me now to talk about the latest developments. Good evening, and thank you for joining me.
Claudia, thank you for having me on.
Pleasure.
And let me commend you for the TVP story that you did on the abduction of Ukrainian children. That's a war crime, and I'm glad you're keeping that on the front minds of people. We should not forget about that.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's incredibly important for us to be spreading these messages and let people know across the globe about these stories. They're very important. Let's take a look at the events which could possibly take place in a few days' time. Everything is still in preparation. There is a lot of discussion going on about the meeting. Trilateral, be it bilateral, we will see. Russians are clearly playing for time to avoid sanctions. Isn't this the right time to actually deal some deadly blows? I mean, it's Friday already. It's 20 minutes past 2 p.m. in Washington, and we haven't seen the secondary sanctions that were supposed to be introduced today. What's your opinion?
Claudia, you're absolutely right. I feel kind of a feeling of deja vu, or Groundhog Day, as we say in the United States. You know, just 3 months ago in mid-May, Zelensky was hosting the Prime Minister of Poland, the Prime Minister of the UK, the President of France, and the Chancellor of Germany in one of his offices in Kiev. And he had a phone call with President Trump in which they threatened Putin with massive, to use that quote, massive economic sanctions if Putin didn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire within 3 days. And Trump backed out of that agreement at the last minute. And that put egg on the face of the United States. It weakened the credibility of the transatlantic community, and it undercut Ukraine. And so I agree with your point. Today is a day we should see significant economic sanctions being imposed on Russia, so that when Putin goes to the table and sits with Putin, Putin fully understands that Trump is ready to exercise, willing to exercise, able to exercise the full scope of American power to force Putin to cease this war. For that reason, and for the reason that these sanctions are needed to weaken Putin's war machine. So yes, I agree with you. Now is the time to impose those sanctions, to exercise those sanctions as he threatened, so that he can have increase the likelihood of constructive negotiations when they meet next week, if they meet next week. If Trump fails to do that, Putin's going to come to the table even more confident he can do a repeat of last May.
So, as you mentioned, we are only days away from a potential meeting between both sides. Do you think after this meeting or during this meeting, we're actually running a risk of Putin convincing Trump not to impose more sanctions on Russia? And what would he have to offer for the U.S. president for that to take place?
Well, Putin's already got a big win. I mean, he's getting to sit down with the leader of the free world, the leader of the most powerful country in the world. That conveys a certain legitimacy. I'm not entirely comfortable with Trump conveying to him. Second, by being mano a mano, alone in the room, so to speak, without other players, Putin has achieved an ability to kind of pull the United States away from Europe and from Ukraine, to create a possible gap between the United States and its allies and its partners. Putin clearly wants to focus not just on Ukraine, but on a broader relationship, a renewal of a relationship, a reset of the relationship between Russia and the United States. And he signaled that, or his administration signaled that, when they described the Witkoff conversation with Putin earlier this week as one that focused not just on Ukraine, but on the prospects of broader cooperation between the United States and Russia. So Putin's coming to the table, not just looking for relief from pressure, but also hoping to further animate Trump's longstanding and well-articulated desire for deals with Russia.
What do you think if a ceasefire would take place, if we would have Putin and Trump and Zelensky sit by one table, do you think that Ukraine would actually have to agree to territorial concessions? I mean, according to the recent poll, the most recent one coming from yesterday, 70% of Ukrainians want peace. 25% of Ukrainians are not willing to have peace if territorial concessions will have to be made. What's your opinion?
Well, one thing that worries me is that when you look at the Trump administration's rhetoric, it focuses, quote unquote, on stopping the killing, which is a legitimate objective, but it can't be the sole objective. If the sole objective, Trump kind of falls into the legacy of Chamberlain, who was focused more on preventing a war rather than thinking about how the prevention of that war actually prevents further wars. So when Trump comes to the table, hopefully in collaboration with the Europeans and above all the Ukrainians, they'll roll out a ceasefire, but one that is geared to resolve some very important issues. One, most importantly, that how to ensure Ukraine's security so that Russia will be deterred from further aggression. Two, it has to protect the principle of sovereignty that Russia has so brutally violated. So it would be a terrible concession, a terrible precedent, if Trump were to agree or to pressure Zelensky to agree to the permanent recognition of Russian sovereignty over the territories it has illegally seized from Ukraine. So a ceasefire cannot accept recognition of that territory. It can, quote unquote, allow it without recognition, backed by continued sanctions until Russia relinquishes those territory. And then, of course, there also has to be discussions on, for example, the children that Russia has abducted, that Putin has abducted, and then also the reparations that Russia owes Ukraine for destroying so much of its Ukrainian territory.
As we're looking at the meeting which is set to take place, do you think that President Zelensky is actually going to attend? Is he going to be invited to the table, or we're going to see this bilateral discussion which will take place between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and then perhaps leading to another meeting take place? And is it fair, especially from a Ukrainian perspective?
From a short answer, I don't know. The indications are, from the press reporting and my colleagues, is that the administration and Putin are focused on a sole meeting between Trump and Zelensky. Trump has signaled that he'd like to have that meeting followed by a trilateral meeting involving Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. What concerns me the most is not so much the meeting, but as what is the strategy behind this meeting. What is Trump going to bring to the table to ensure that a ceasefire leads to kind of a just and stable peace? And the Trump administration hasn't signaled anything in that regard, and that's troubling to me.
So we have Donald Trump, we have Vladimir Putin, there's also Volodymyr Zelensky, but what about Europe? What about some of these countries that actually joined the coalition of the willing, that are initially not involved into the talk, which is supposed to take place next week? What is going to be EU's extent of participation?
Well, in this round of negotiations, probably there will be no European presence. But a positive sign is that Trump actually reached out to a number of Europeans immediately after the Witkoff conversations with Putin, and laid out to them his vision for going forward. And there doesn't seem to be much pushback from U.S. European allies, including Poland, including Germany, including France and the UK, against this way forward. The key is what's going to be going on underneath the table, so to speak, what's not going to be seen. The key is what kind of coordination is the Trump administration facilitating with our European allies? And right now, it sounds like there's a fair amount of conversation going on.
As our program is coming to an end, I wanted to ask you this final question. In your opinion, do you think that the war in Ukraine actually benefits a certain party, certain interests, to a point which is postponing reaching a ceasefire and peace? What's your opinion?
I think the reason why we haven't gotten to a ceasefire and to serious peace negotiations is because the West has failed to exercise the full weight of its power, its full massive overbalance of power against Russia. I've said this on the show earlier, so forgive me for repeating. NATO is an alliance that has some $54 trillion in GDP. Russia's got less than 2. That's a 25 times differential. The alliance spends about $1.5 trillion on defense. Russia, even with this full-scale war and a war economy, spends well less than $200 billion. It's amazing we haven't used this geoeconomic, geopolitical, military overmatch to enable Ukraine to crush this invasion. It's in our power to do so. We just haven't demonstrated the political will to do so. That's what haunts me. And I'm hoping at some point in the near future, the transatlantic community will come to the recognition of that and exercise that power. Because if it does, peace will be at hand. It will be fast and it will be swift, because Putin will immediately get into a defensive position simply to protect the territory that he has seized. It's time for us to act now with decisiveness. We have the capability.
Peace will be at hand. How beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining me. Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, was my guest. Great to have you.
If we exercise our power.
If we exercise our power. Thank you so much. And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Thank you very much for joining me. And I do hope to see you back here on TVP World for more.